Hello, everyone, and welcome to the DRI Reading Group. I'm Erin Daly. I'm President and Executive Director of Dignity Rights International. DRI is a civil society organization dedicated to advancing the human dignity of every person everywhere through education, advocacy, and consultation. You can learn more about DRI at our website at dignityrights.org. One of our signature programs is our reading group, now completing its second year. The reading group is designed to make conversation about cutting-edge ideas in dignity scholarship freely accessible to all. So I'm very happy to welcome you all here today. I'm especially happy to welcome four wonderful scholars whose work could not be more timely or more critical, focusing as it does on the relationship between human dignity and democracy. Their new book, Human Dignity and Democracy in Europe, Synergies, Tensions, and Crises, was recently published by Edward Elgar, and it's the product of an extraordinary conference that was held a few years ago at the European University Institute outside Florence. The book starts by bringing to light new ways of seeing democracy when we consider it from the perspective of human dignity. That is, from the diversity of human beings living together and the diversity of their identities. So the collection considers these important questions both through the lens of identity and solidarity. It asks what the relationship is between dignity and democracy, and crucially, whether the two crises of dignity and of democracy are related. So let me first introduce the editors. You'll see, for those of you who don't already know them, what fascinating people and committed scholars they are. Daniel Bedford is senior lecturer in law at the University of Portsmouth, where his research draws on the capabilities approach, vulnerability theory, and relational accounts of selfhood, all ideas that are really complex and interesting and very much related to human dignity. Catherine Dupré at the University of Exeter has been a longtime supporter and friend of DRI and sits on our board of directors. She's also an alumni of the reading group, having been our guest last year to discuss her book, The Age of Dignity. Catherine is associate professor of comparative constitutional law at the University of Exeter, where she teaches courses on dignity law. Gabor Halmai is professor and chair of the Comparative Constitutional Law Department at the European University Institute in Florence, where his research interests are comparative and European constitutional law. And finally, Panos Kapotos is, with Daniel, senior lecturer in law at the University of Portsmouth, where he focuses on equality and non-discrimination in Europe. I would also like to mention that several contributors to the book are with us today. Cesare Pinelli, Przemysław Tatzik, and I believe Stephen Riley will be joining us soon. And let me also mention that Jacob Weinrib, who sits on DRI's advisory council and who is also an alum of the reading group, participated in the Florence conference. So let's talk about democracy and dignity. Daniel, can you tell us a little bit about how this book came to be?
Thank you, Erin, and thank you for that fantastic introduction. So in 2017, it was a long time ago now, we organized a conference at the EUI, as you mentioned, in Florence. And we brought together a range of scholars to consider the implications of a range of crises and the responses to these crises, to the shared commitment to respect human dignity that is foundational to the European constitutional order. So as part of the conference, we explored the implications for the commitment to human dignity of the rise of populism, of xenophobia, of so-called illiberal democracy, and the breakdown of social solidarity following the politics of austerity. Now, at the time, in 2017, there had been much discussion of these various crises and the responses to them. And the discussion had considered attacks on some of the core principles of the European constitutional order, including the rule of law and the separation of powers. However, there'd been less attention paid to the way in which these attacks, or the attacks on democracy in Europe, also entailed perhaps attacks on the foundational commitment to human dignity. So one of the reasons what we wanted to focus on was this commitment to human dignity at the core of European constitutionalism and the ways in which that commitment was perhaps being undermined by what has been termed democratic backsliding. And the reason for focusing on dignity was in part that human dignity has consistently within Europe marked the beginning of a kind of new democratic era. In the second half of the 20th century, the codification of human dignity across many nation states coincided with the transition to democracy and a commitment to a greater protection of human rights. So we saw the crises that were emerging at the time as a potential undermining of this commitment that had emerged to never again repeat the sorts of mistakes that did occur in the past. So it was in this context that we explored the connections between dignity and democracy and the ways in which perhaps this commitment was being undermined as a consequence of the crises at the time. So that was the context and the background to the volume. I think Catherine is now going to explore a little bit more the concept of democracy.
Thanks so much, Daniel.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for that. So, yeah, dignity is not only a deep European commitment, but as many of us know, and many of the people listening will know, it's also been codified in the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and that may be where the beginning of things changing for the concept of human rights. And what we're looking is how those changes to human rights may have also affected democracy. So there are many ways, many ways of looking at democracy, and the book just looks at a range of approaches. But perhaps the one fundamental question at the starting point of the book and the work we did together is the one fundamental question about democracy is how can we keep people together? How can we include everybody living on the same territory and make sure that they can all take part in the decisions that affect them? So collective decision-making process for collective decisions. How is this possible? And I think that is the fundamental question of democracy that cuts across the whole volume and the whole project. There are two specific sub-questions for democracy that the book addresses in various ways. And the first is the question of identity, and the second is the question of solidarity. So the question of identity, of collective identity, perhaps above all, is about how it is possible to bring different people together on the same territory. How it is possible to construct a sense of identity for all those people who are otherwise quite different. How can we create a sense of belonging from inside, but how can we also create a sense of distinctive identity so that identity, remains actually meaningful? And if you look at the book cover, so we had a little discussion, just trying to put it on camera, in terms of choosing the picture, and we chose that picture. I think it's credit goes to Panos for that. And we liked it because it represents precisely what democracy is. It's all many people, different people being together. So the differences here are illustrated by the different colors, but the differences are also illustrated by the different ways in which people look. So that represents both disagreements, dissent, but also pluralism. So that's the enigma of democracy, how to keep those people together, how to let agreement be part of democracy and manage those disagreements in a peaceful way. I think we need to mention peace here. I'm just sowing a seed perhaps for the discussion. And that's the question. That's one of the questions addressed by identity. The second sub-question of democracy is the question of solidarity. And in short, and if I can make things a little bit simple, is the question about, what is the glue that holds these people together? And in practical terms, it's the question about, how may rich people help poor people? How may the healthy help the sick and nurse them back to health? how may the young help the elderly? How may our current generation, nurture the space for future generations to rise after us? And that's a question of solidarity, and a question that arises in normal situations and as well as in situation of crisis. We'll hear about that in a little while. This question of solidarity is key for discussions on welfare. It's also key from a perspective of social justice, but it's absolutely fundamental for the quality of democracy and for democracy itself, because it is the, I think, condition or requirement through which people can actually take part in those collective decision making process. It's the reason, it's how people can actually take part in making decisions that affect them all. So what the book shows and discusses, I think, remarkably well, because as editors here, we didn't give any steer in terms of what contributors should do, is the continuum that we see between the individual dimensions of democracy and the collective dimensions. So the continuum between the individual level of democracy and collective level. Erin, I think you used the image of an arc between the two levels. And I think before I hand over to Daniel again, this arc, this bridge, I think we can call it dignity for now, to keep things simple. Thank you. Daniel, it's over to you now on human dignity.
Thanks, Catherine. So just building on what Catherine was saying, when we were thinking about the connection between dignity and democracy, we were thinking about, I think, a number of the contributors to the collection, the role that dignity plays in kind of expanding the scope of democracy and the extent to which it requires recognition of diverse identities. So one of the key themes that appears is that the commitment to dignity is concerned with recognition of diverse identities in a way that supports individuals to recognize their own worth and belonging as a member of society. And about expanding the boundaries of democratic society and ensuring the inclusion of non-citizens and non-nationals and ensuring their protection and the protection of their rights. So there were various contributions that looked at the protection of asylum seekers and refugees and the ways in which human dignity has been central to their protection and inclusion within democratic societies. And we also explored, as part of the solidarity aspect, the ways in which human dignity was about securing a decent minimum level of subsistence for all within the societies in which they were living. And we looked at the ways, or contributions, looked at the ways in which that commitment to human dignity was about securing the physical existence of the human being and meet a basic minimum to ensure food, clothing, and shelter, for example, but also extending further than this. And this is something, again, Erin, I think, picks up on in her own contribution, the way in which securing a decent minimum existence is about more than maintaining material comfort alone, but is about ensuring that persons can be active participants in the life of the community, that they are able to take part in society. So the important German Constitutional Court decision in which it was stated that human dignity, a decent minimum level of human dignity, encompasses the opportunity to maintain interpersonal relationships and a minimum level of participation in social, cultural, and political life. So going beyond just a decent existence in the sense of material comfort to including participation and in society. So those are some of the dimensions of human dignity I think we looked at that kind of connect with the themes that Catherine was mentioning. And then I think now it's going to be Gabor who's going to explore some of the issues surrounding the crises and the ways in which the crises may have impinged on these sorts of commitments.
Yes, so the so-called converging crisis situation in all over Europe, which the book tries to capture somehow, starting from the financial crisis through the refugee crisis. The pandemic was not really covered by the book because, as we mentioned, the conference took place in 2018. But certainly the pandemic and the war in Ukraine as the latest crisis all somehow demonstrate the kind of erosion of liberal democracy based on human dignity. And one pessimistic reading of this book, and let me be that pessimist coming from Eastern and Central Europe, together with Przemysław, who is with us today from Poland. My home country, Hungary, is certainly one of the countries which demonstrates all these erosions of liberal democracy till an autocratic system totally ignoring not only the basic values of liberal democracy, but with that, of course, also human dignity. And this is something which can be detected in these two of the case studies. Actually, we have very few case studies, country case studies in the book. Besides Poland and Hungary, we have Dan's chapter on the UK, which, even if not the same way as Poland and Hungary, can also be considered as a country on a way towards a kind of democratic backsliding, which may also end up with violations of human dignity. But what we, together with Przemysław in the Hungarian and the Polish case, try to prove that there is an emerging alternative among, first of all, East Central European countries, but I have to say that not only in East Central European countries, within East Central Europe, certainly not only in Poland and Hungary. And this alternative is the so-called illiberal democracy, as it called by Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban. How much it is an oxymoronical term, it certainly shows that the lack of separation of power, the lack of guaranteed fundamental rights, certainly leads to certain kind of ignorance towards dignity of equal citizens, not only citizens of the given country, but citizens of other countries in the case of the migration crisis, and in the case of the war, especially. I have to mention my home country as maybe the worst case in denying any kind of solidarity towards the people and the people's dignity in Ukraine, protecting Russia, who initiated this war. So this kind of alternative is there in Europe, and it warns all of us that it can be spread over these two countries. Thank you.
And if I may, Aaron, I'd like to say just a few words to perhaps create a bridge, since we've already used the metaphor, with our discussion. We've made a conscious decision, the four of us with Erin, to keep our initial presentation very short, both because we really want to engage in a discussion with everyone, and because we were hoping that we'll have many of our contributors in this virtual Zoom room, as we indeed do, and it would be great to hear from them as well. So let me just say a few words to try and share with you our thoughts on why the book remains today as topical, as relevant, if not more, as it was at the time of its inception 5 years ago. And Gabor already mentioned both this illiberal democracy narrative that is indeed spreading in other parts of the world outside Europe, but he also mentioned the new crisis, the crisis that were not on the horizon when we started working on the book. And obviously the pandemic is the one that has affected everybody, affected not just European countries and residents of European countries, but I think it's probably the one to think about a bit more in view of the relationship between dignity and democracy, because it encapsulates this paradox of the relationship, the inherent paradox. We started off thinking of the pandemic, and this was part of the political narrative in many European states, as the great equalizer. So the virus was attacking everyone, regardless of age, regardless of personal characteristics, of financial status, and so on. But I think it's fair to say that even those who propagated this narrative at the start of the pandemic soon discovered that this was not the case, that the pandemic created a multiplicity of crises that exacerbated existing inequalities and created new inequalities. So this asymmetry of the impact of the multiple crises that the pandemic creates is, I think, at the very heart of the relationship between dignity and democracy, and the choices that elected representatives, that parliaments and governments made in different countries are choices that should be scrutinized from the perspective of this relationship. I should also mention, as Gabor did, the war in Ukraine. Allow me to say that it's clearly an act of open and unqualified aggression. It is reminiscent, unfortunately, of the haunting memories of World War II. But I think part of the question here is, how do we collectively respond to such an act of aggression? How do we protect democracy, both in Ukraine and in Europe? How do we ensure that we protect the dignity of the Ukrainian people, and at the same time we do not allow an autocrat, one of the many that European soil seems to breed these days in the last few decades, to drag us back into a place that we collectively committed at the end of World War II we'd never go again. And this is perhaps one of the most terrifying prospects of the war in Ukraine. And let me say one final thing. This is what we were discussing with Erin just before the start of this webinar. I'm sure that for our American colleagues, Roe v. Wade is very well at the top of one's mind, I would think. And it seems to me that the complexity of the relationship between dignity and democracy, the complexity that arises both by looking at issues of representation and identity, and by understanding that democracy is not necessarily one thing, it's not necessarily one singular concept, is perhaps best illustrated in the debate that has already started after the leak of the draft decision of the US Supreme Court. I have very strong views I hope, in case it is not clear, that they are in favor of Roe v. Wade, a wonderful decision in many respects. But I will not share them now because I'd like us to have as much time as possible for questions. Thank you very much, Erin.
Thank you. Well, to the four of you for just bringing this extraordinary book to fruition, for having the idea and the conference, and then just to bring it out so that more and more people can share in the knowledge and the wisdom of this collected group. I did just note, you're welcome to post questions in the chat, but also just if you want to raise any issues, don't feel limited to the chat, and feel free to just either use the raise hand function or speak up. I wonder if I can sort of use my professorial authority and cold call some people, but I just want to invite Cesare and Przemysław, if they would like to add anything as contributors to this book, if we can just maybe hear from you if you would like to add something, and then we can open it up to a broader discussion.
Can I add something? Now, first of all, I'm very sorry to tell you that within 10 minutes, I have to leave you. I'm very sorry, but I have really something I cannot miss. But for the rest, I think that the issue raises perhaps more than other chapters of law, the question of how the is-ought dichotomy is concretely felt and analyzed in our scientific words and in the experience. Why? Because dignity has become something that raises far more questions than other principles to the absolutely common way of thinking to rights and democracy. And I think that what has happened after the moment in which we conceived our contribution demonstrates that the book is even more telling than it was when we conceived this book. Because really we are experimenting now challenges to dignity we couldn't imagine. It is really dreadful what we are looking at every day, and I think the need for an effort for thinking together to how to react, of course, at our level, which is a very, very little level, but still we can ask ourselves how, to what extent at least, we can tell something about the recent challenges, and you all understand what I'm telling about. We have seen about the attacks on dignity in these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for joining, and we're sorry that you'll have to leave soon, but we really appreciate that contribution. Przemysław, would you like to add something? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for this event. I mean, it's splendid, and I'm very happy that I'm able to participate. Well, I would add a couple of things. Well, first of all, the very idea of the book was conceived, well, maybe not a long time ago, but in terms of the development of populism in Europe, that was quite a long time ago. And of course, we live in strange times in which everything changes very, very fast. So, of course, in 2018, we wouldn't have imagined that this whole crisis would become so multidimensional. When I was writing my contribution, I still wasn't able to see all the consequences of the transformation that was going on. perhaps Gabor was in a better situation because this process in Hungary was already quite developed. But right now, what we might see is that, of course, this process went very, very far, both in Poland and Hungary. These two countries have become certain laboratories of populism. But some kind of a general reflection that I've had in my chapter was that the concept of dignity is something that provides a safety valve between law and politics. In liberal constitutionalism, this valve is deliberately conceived of as a kind of a filter that allows extra legal values to penetrate the legal system. What is interesting, however, is what happens when populism dismantles liberal constitutionalism. And what I believe was demonstrated both in Hungary and in Poland was the process of dismantling this sort of barrier between politics and law that was so precious, that was perhaps at the heart of liberal constitutionalism. And together with that went on the process of undermining of human dignity as a working concept within legal systems. Which also means that human dignity, of course, apart from being a very noble and thought-provoking concept within jurisprudence and within constitutionalism, is in many respects worth as much as institutions that safeguard it. As soon as these institutions, like constitutional courts, or generally speaking, domestic judiciary, if they are assaulted, intercepted, dismantled, this also means that the concept of dignity loses its place and its power. This, of course, does not mean that this concept ceases to be important for lawyers, because it's still a kind of a point of reference that might be used even if the home institutions are no longer able to use them properly. So from the perspective of May 2022, I see our book as a kind perhaps of a starting point for a new reflection of how these processes of changes are going to happen in Europe, because certainly it's not the beginning. It's perhaps, to quote Churchill, it's not the beginning of the beginning. Perhaps we are well into the beginning, but the transformations that we might see are very, very far-fetched. And of course, war in Ukraine contributes to that. It's been of many surprises to people and to scholars on populism how differently populist states reacted to war in Ukraine, with Hungary more or less siding with Russia, or at least tacitly supporting Russia, and with Poland being quite openly adamant in supporting Ukraine, which was perhaps even for me as a scholar who dealt with the Polish populism for a long time, it's been a surprise that the Polish government reacted so well to this crisis, which of course doesn't anyhow undermine or diminish the responsibility of the Polish government for what happened on the Polish-Belarusian border, which is of course part of another story. So to wrap up, I think that as Cesare said, I believe that of course our book might becoming more and more telling as the crisis develops, but of course maybe in a couple of years, maybe in a decade, it will require reviewing, reconsidering, and seeing how the process of changes in Europe made this book relevant. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for those additional contributions. I would like to just open this up to anybody. I think we've heard from some very thought-provoking speakers, and we all have a lot of things on our mind, whether it's war or, as Panos mentioned, the news from the United States yesterday about abortion rights, or otherwise, the recent French election, all kinds of issues that we can sort of connect to this. So let's go to our audience, Penny, and then Jimmy.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you for the presenters. This looks like a really fascinating book, and I'm sorry I've not had the opportunity to read it, but I do plan to. And it just raises so many important questions, just looking at the table of contents and the description. My question is based on my experience in South Africa, where you know that the concept of dignity is not only included in the Constitution, but also has been given some meaning by the Constitutional Court in its interpretation. What I'm interested in is, and one of the earlier speakers made this point, the link between human dignity and democracy, clearly important. But I'm just wondering what kind of democracy we're thinking about. So for example, in South Africa, economic justice is front and center, key to this question of dignity. And I'm thinking particularly about how dignity exists as an arcane construct in many ways, because so many people have not operationalized the idea of dignity. If you think of the xenophobia in the country, if you think of a range of human rights violations by people who are similarly situated, poor people. So I'm just wondering how we think about this as kind of a way in which it's internalized so that it really does contribute to a vibrant democracy, because people see dignity as inherent in the way that they run their lives. I mean, I'm sure this is a sort of a hackneyed question. It's also a difficult question, but that's what I'm left with, because I've just got some news from South Africa again, and I sort of wonder how we think about operationalizing dignity in a very, very fundamental core way, outside of the academic and the legal and the judicial construct. So thank you.
I'll just leave that for anybody who would like to sort of comment on it. Go ahead, Catherine.
Okay, thank you very much, Penny, for your question. And of course, you've done really well to bring South Africa here into the discussion, because it was a groundbreaking constitution, and it really contributed to sort of, as you said, use the word operationalize human dignity in the text, in the context of a constitutional text, and then in the case law of your constitutional court. There are probably many different ways in which we can go further, but the first thing to note, and perhaps we tend not to notice it, is that dignity is there on people's mind, and people probably, reading into what you're saying, well, there is something missing there that prevents the full realization of human dignity. But in order to say that, it shows your awareness of the existence of human dignity as a kind of ideal requirement that should be part to a greater extent of the South African democracy than perhaps it is now. And so this is one thing, the fact that it's there, and we have this word, this phrase, and it's not just a phrase to which many people, if not everybody, can relate intuitively. You don't need a PhD in law to understand what human dignity is. People relate to it, and people talk about human dignity in very, very similar ways across many different parts of the world. But what it does in relation to democracy is also something else. It's just shifting the gaze and the attention and the effort away from elections, which are really, really important, but not enough. And perhaps in the context of South Africa, and to bring the issue of solidarity into the discussion, because it is one of the topics of the book, is, the importance of creating better solidarity, fostering solidarity amongst people at all sorts of levels. That could be one way of operationalizing human dignity further, and in very basic and mundane day-to-day ways. That's one thought I would put to you. But thanks very much for your question.
Thank you, Catherine.
Gabor, did you want to say something in response to that?
Yes, let me use this very unique opportunity to be proud of something which is Hungarian. Namely, Penny mentioned the South African case and the Constitutional Court's instrumental role to promote human dignity. The Hungarian Constitutional Court did the same thing in the very beginning of the 90s, and I'm very proud to be part of this story. Actually, Catherine wrote a fascinating book about this import of human dignity into the Hungarian constitutional practice, import from the German concept. What I want to say here, this moment has passed, of course, the moment of proud about the Hungarian constitutional adjudication, because the court is packed, but here comes something which is probably worth to mention, that what happened with the dismantling of democracy and human dignity altogether, especially in the mentioned two East European countries so far, it's not something which happened without using the law. It's actually very much a legal process. And the Constitutional Court, the new one, the packed Constitutional Court, unfortunately contributed with its legal analysis to misuse and abuse the concept of human dignity altogether, the concept of identity, referring to the Hungarians' identity not to receive any migrants because they are Christian, and the migrants maybe not having the same religion. So this is also the responsibility of lawyers here, because this is a kind of legalism, as Kim Shapley calls it, autocratic legalism. It's not the same way of dictatorial rule, totally ignoring any kind of law. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that sobering contribution also. Jimmy, and for those of you who don't know, Jimmy is the co-founder of Dignity Rights International and sits on the board, and is also senior counsel and my colleague in much dignity writing and throughout the years. So Jimmy, your question.
Well, let me say, first of all, good morning and good afternoon to everybody. Maybe good evening too. Thank you so much for sharing your ideas and thoughts. And congratulations on this wonderful book. I think it's a fantastic contribution to the conversation about the role of dignity in general and in democracy in particular. But my question goes to sort of the Janus-faced attributes of dignity in democracy. There's a light side and a dark side, and I'd like to get your thoughts, those of you who contributed to the book, your thoughts about this. Let me put it into context. So on the light side of dignity, you know, it's that dignity supports democracy, that civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights that you write about in your book support democracy, assembly, petition, voting on the former, and on the latter, education, equality, health, and other rights. So in those ways we see kind of a clear, inextricable entwinement of dignity and democracy. And it's sort of the light side of that equation. But there's a dark side to it too, right? And this goes to comments that Gabor was just making and that Cesar made earlier in particular, and then also echoed by what Penny was mentioning about the role of dignity in the Constitutional Court in South Africa. But in a democracy, particularly a majoritarian democracy, we have the tyranny of the democracy. And in that way, it can work against dignity and the embracement of dignity and advancement of human dignity. We have, you know, some recent examples like in the United States that it sounds like there was a discussion about before this book discussion began, with the Supreme Court looking to, you know, take away reproductive rights, a fundamental right that's been recognized for a half a century. And that's a reflection of democracy as well. So here's my question. In a democracy, what good does dignity do? And what good does democracy do dignity? And the final comment on that is that, you know, Hungary is a democracy. Brazil is a democracy. The Philippines, democracy. The United States, democracy. Democracy comes with kind of a coarse underbelly as well, as we've learned about. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the role of democracy and dignity. What role does dignity play for democracy, and democracy play for dignity going forward in the world, given all the strife and war and conflict and autocracy that's happening under the ruse of democracy? Anyway, thanks very much.
Thank you for that. I think the floor is open to anybody who would like to respond. Panos, go ahead.
I think that Gabor beat me to it. So Gabor, please.
No.
I'll be very brief. I'll just say that I think that Jimmy's question is along the same lines that the comments by Zainab and Lubem in the chat are. And for me, there is a short, perhaps slightly symbolic answer here from a European perspective that comes from the mandate of the Council of Europe. Democracy is not a singular concept, because democracy is part of a framework that works together with the rule of law and with the protection of human rights, the protection of fundamental rights. And it is quite apt, I think, that the reading group is named as it is, because the operationalization of dignity, at least in my mind, in my view, can only come through human rights. The way, of course, rights are or are not justiciable, and Jimmy did mention rights that are on both sides of that particular divide, or the way that rights create positive obligations that go above and beyond the mere obligation of the state to refrain from violating them, is a matter of judicial practice. And I cannot say that in Europe currently judicial practice, either at the national level or at the European level, I'm referring to the European Court of Human Rights and possibly even the Court of Justice of the European Union, is standing up to the challenges to democracy and dignity. But at least from an academic lawyer's perspective, I cannot see many other alternatives. I think that the solution can only come from accepting that the tyranny of the majority has a very clear counter, and that counter is the protection of fundamental rights and the commitment to the rule of law.
Catherine.
Yeah, thanks very much, Panos and Jim, for raising this question. I mean, just to follow up a little bit on Panos's point. Yeah, it's not what dignity does for democracy, and certainly in the European context, but probably not only in the European context. So it's what Panos does, is bringing human rights in the democratic framework and in the democratic discussion, so that the majority cannot be tyrannical, so that the rights of the minority and the rights of everybody, not just those in Paris or those who have the voting rights, are protected. And that is a revolution. That is a revolution that took place through the adoption, of human rights instruments and through constitutions, post-war constitutions in Europe, and post-communist constitution in Hungary, for instance. And that is something to always bear in mind. The definition, the expectation, and the overall framework of democracy has changed. But within those rights, there are a few rights. I tend to call them core rights. When we go to the core of human dignity, we find the absolute prohibition to treat people in inhuman ways, and it's the absolute prohibition to torture technically and subject people to inhuman and degrading treatment and punishment. When that prohibition starts, politics stops. And that's also a really, really strong limit to the power of majority politics. Democracy remains majoritarian politics and etc. But there is one territory in which they cannot go, which is that territory which is protected by absolute prohibition to take away human dignity to the point of dehumanizing people. Most rights, as we know, can be limited up to a point, and this is where we have courts and discussions, but the core of dignity may never be limited, no matter what the politics is, even supported by majority issues. And that is a huge transformation to democracy, as I understand it. But I can see fellow contributors want to talk, so I'll stop my point. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Catherine. Panos.
I'll just add a very brief remark to what has been already said. Namely, democracy is, of course, a very broad concept, which is used by forces from all sides of the political spectrum. And this is a concept which, I come from the background of critical legal studies, so I would say that this is more like a floating signifier, something that possesses little meaning of its own and becomes meaningful only when applied within the context of a given fight. So the beauty of the liberal project of liberal constitutionalism was to identify democracy with a certain meaning of democracy, liberal democracy in which human dignity would play a crucial part alongside human rights. But of course, we need to accept the fact that democracy will always be something more than that. Therefore, I don't find it particularly productive to say that when populists or illiberal forces claim that they are also democratic, that they mean democracy in the other way. I wouldn't think that it is productive to say that they are not democratic. In a sense, they are. The trouble is with the many meanings of democracy, and I believe that the area where we should fight them is precisely the area of human dignity. So we can agree that the form that they want to propose is, in a certain sense, democratic. So it's outside of the political fight whether it's democratic or not. This is futile. But the crucial thing is whether they respect human dignity and human rights, and this is where we can continue the struggle.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you for the question, James. And building on what was just mentioned, one of the things that we do discuss in the introduction is the difference between sort of thinner and thicker conceptualizations of democracy, and the ways in which dignity has been used to kind of develop a kind of thicker, more substantive idea of democracy. And I think Catherine uses the terminology society of moral equals, whereas I conform to community of moral equals. But the basic kind of idea that in a community where we relate to one another on the basis of dignity, we do so with a commitment to mutual respect, and that when we shape collective life together, we do so in a way that we are answerable and accountable to each other in recognizing the equal authority of others as claim makers. The idea that a person we have a commitment to provide reasons to others that are responsive to them as persons of equal importance, and in turn they are responsive to us. And that if we are to provide a justification for why we treat the person in a certain way, we do so in a way that recognizes their equal importance rather than treating them as lesser human beings. So I think that's something that we do pick up on the introduction. I think it's also discussed in some of the contributions to the collection.
Thank you. I think one of the things that all of this scholarship and this work is doing is helping to build not just sort of a greater understanding of dignity, but a greater vocabulary to help us talk about it in these different ways. So I appreciate that contribution also. Gabor.
Yes, this is just a very small addition to what my co-editors and co-authors have said, which I fully agree with. One small thing about Hungary. Jimmy mentioned Hungary as a democracy. I think besides the substantial elements, there is one crucial point of being a democracy, namely having elections which the result of which is uncertain. In Hungary, this is not the case. So we do not have an election where the result is uncertain. The April election could not be won by the opposition due to the rules.
And that raises for the United States interesting questions about gerrymandering and other mechanisms that are part of democracy that may affect how much each person's participation counts. Related to that, I just want to bring in, I guess, a couple comments that are in the chat that you've all seen, but I just want to sort of raise them. One from sort of a structural perspective. Zainab, who joins us from Morocco, asks what appears to be an assumption that restoring democracy will restore dignity. And she says, I'm wondering if the democratic backsliding and the crisis of social solidarity isn't also revealing structural issues with democratic models in many places around the world that have created power hoarding, power manipulation, et cetera. I think building very much on the idea that Gabor was just talking about. But the question I think is so intriguing, could there be alternative political models for dignified societies? And I wonder how the editors and contributors think about that. And I'll just bring Lubam's question, who joins us from Nigeria, also into this with a very different dimension of it, looking at sort of the socioeconomic rights and the ability of governments to protect the material dimensions of human dignity that are required in a society that proclaims to respect it. So thoughts about either of those from anyone? Kevin. You're on mute.
Sorry, I thought I had. Thank you very much for those questions. I will answer maybe that the alternative models of democracy start with rethinking or thinking again what human beings are about, and our imagination of what human beings are about. And this is what is happening at the moment. And the one source of reason of optimism I have when I watch what's happening in Hungary and in Poland is that something good might come out of it. We may be learning things, and certainly it's our sort of duty to try to learn things. So let me try to explain a little bit and keep things really simple. What is the image of the human being at the center of, let's say, majority democracy and human rights, like traditionally or mainstream, if we want to put it like this? I mean, it's a citizen or it's a national. That is one definition. It's not the universal. It's that, you know, it has a nationality, that person. And in terms of human rights, because the focus is on sort of civil and political rights, it's a person that has apparently nobody or very few needs, and seems to live happily on their own. And what bringing dignity does, if we bring this dignity into the discussion, it changes what this picture is at the basis of democracy, of this picture of human beings at the basis of democracy. And then we see a picture that is, I think, richer, that is perhaps more accurate, closer to who we are and what we are in reality. And we see the beginning of interaction, relationship, needs, etc., that gradually are being claimed and asserted through human dignity and through court cases. But I think I would go back to, you know, who are the people living at the heart of a democracy? I would put the question like this as well. Thank you. I see Gabor wants to talk, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
I just want to say before Gabor speaks, but I think that framing is a really interesting and really potentially very useful one, to think about dignity and the discourse around dignity and the demands of dignity in terms of what a human being is, what a human being needs. both individually, collectively, et cetera, and all the different dimensions of our human experience. Gabor.
Yes, thank you. So talking about the democratic systems or structures Zainab is asking for, one experience of the democratic transition in the former communist countries, including Hungary and Poland, I guess, is that whatever system the constitution making process produced, it was certainly a kind of elitist project. So what was lacking at that time, and I guess this is something which also one of the reasons of the backsliding, any kind of contribution of the people, in other words, any kind of deliberation about the model and the way in which a country imagines its future system of governance is very much needed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And let me just also read a comment, unless Natalie, if you'd like to say it, or I can just read it.
Yeah, I can
Okay.
I can say that if you prefer. So yeah, well, I say first, thanks for the really interesting presentation. So yeah, I mean, I was just thinking that these two questions we've just had in some ways kind of go quite well together, because one of the issues with democracy is also how, in some ways, quite limited it is. So, I mean, we all live in different systems. In the UK, for example, we vote, once every 5 years. Often the Prime Minister doesn't actually have majority support, and we have very little control kind of over resources in between. We don't have enforceable social and economic rights. So, yeah, so the question was, should we be thinking about enhanced forms of democracy? I recognize there's dangers in that as well, because of the the concerns about majoritarianism. So I'm not suggesting it in a way of like, we should have referendums on civil rights issues. I'm suggesting it more in terms of resource allocation questions,
which would maybe help to go to Lubin's comment from previously about that brings to the fore the issues of resource allocations. Panos.
Just a very quick reaction to what Natalie brought up, because I think the issue of referenda is quite a hot topic, I think, of debate with regard to democracy, especially for those of us who live and work in the UK after the infamous referendum on Brexit. It seems to me, and forgive me if I'm exaggerating, that the assumption that Zainab is talking about, the assumption that restoring democracy will restore dignity, is not necessarily a liberal assumption. It is an assumption that can be made from different parts of the political spectrum, because the assumption depends on one's understanding of democracy. So part of the narrative in the UK leading up to the Brexit referendum was that a no vote, a Brexit vote, would restore democracy, would bring back sovereignty to the hands of the British people. I'm not trying to be flippant. We've already suggested that democracy is not a singular concept, and I think most of us agree on that. And I actually agree with both Zainab's comment and Natalie's comment. I just think that part of the issue that we usually casually identify with dignity, that it's a very broad concept and it may be misused, is also a problem with the concept of democracy.
Thanks. Catherine and then Daniel.
Yeah, thanks. I want to build on those points and follow up and bring back in the discussion the issue of uncertainty that was raised by Gabor, because I think here with this idea of uncertainty, I think we are at the heart of what dignity and democracy are. I mean, I think dignity and democracy fundamentally are more about the question, what is a human being? What is a democracy? And just reminding ourselves that we never know for sure what it is, and we are never safe. So it's sort of warning us against complacency. And dignity is very much the phrase or the tool that can help contest established definition or open up new discussion. We see dignity developed a lot in the context of bioethics, for instance. What is a human being? Do we know, what do we want a human being to be or to become? And the framework within which we can raise those questions and we can begin to answer those questions has to be democracy, because it takes a particular kind of political and legal framework to allow for those questions to be explored in ways that are inclusive, in the manners we've discussed so far. So I think the uncertainty is a very, very important dimension at the heart of democracy and dignity. Thank you.
Thanks. And maybe we'll give the last word to you, Daniel.
I was just going to pick up on something that Panos was talking about in relation to referenda. And one of the things that we explored in the conference, but we didn't actually get to address, unfortunately, in the collection, was the ways in which perhaps dignity could say that some things are just not on the table for discussion, and that they cannot be subject to referenda. I can't remember exactly what the contributions were, Catherine, Panos, and Gabor. Can you remember? It was in relation to several referenda, not the Brexit debate, but things like homosexual marriage, for example, and whether those things really should be capable of being decided via majority voting, or whether it's simply a matter that they are things that are required as a base on the basis of human dignity. So there was some very interesting discussion in the conference on that we didn't unfortunately cover in the collection. So I thought I'd just raise that.
Thank you so much. And it goes back to also Catherine's comment earlier about torture and other kinds of these very, very fundamental rights. I guess I also, I can't help but bring in, Panos had raised it earlier, but this question about reproductive rights that is so much on the minds of many Americans today and others around the world. I want to mention something about a case, not Roe, but Casey, which is a case that you might have heard about, a 1992 case that sort of in some way reaffirmed Roe. And it's really the case that the court now may be moving away from also. Casey is important for a couple of reasons that are really relevant to the discussion today. One is it's the first case that really associates that talks about human dignity in the context of these kinds of rights. And so it recognizes that when you talk about certain rights being off the table, like torture, but it's not clear where that ends, because again, if dignity is about what's important to the human person, all kinds of rights, including socioeconomic rights, including intellectual growth rights, including reproductive and other kinds of health rights, are connected to dignity. And what the court in Casey said, the plurality in Casey said, is that the main reason that they reaffirmed Roe was because of the importance of reproductive rights to the ability of women to participate in the social and economic life of the nation. So this real strong connection between dignity and individual rights, things that are important to people, and participating in political life, in social life, in collective and community life. And they kind of got that. And I think that's what we're all struggling with right now. And I just want to sort of close by maybe reframing the question, because it seems to me that we're all recognizing a couple of things. One is that we remain completely committed to the idea of human dignity, and not just as an idea, but as a political tool, as a legal tool, as a lever. but also to the idea of some form of democracy, some form of what we would consider liberal democracy, however that ends up being defined and whatever the particularities of that are. So it seems to me that the question is just how do we use the concept of dignity to actually strengthen democracy, and vice versa? How do we use democracy and the democratic choices that people make to strengthen rather than weaken human dignity? So I want to thank everybody for a really interesting, intriguing, and spirited discussion about these very, very complex issues. I want to thank the contributors who were able to join us today. And also especially, I want to thank the 4 editors who really conceived of this and brought it into being. The book just came out, so we're all looking forward to reading it and exploring these issues much more. And on behalf of DRI, thanks very much. Bye-bye.